And so you want to specify it and you think, okay, well, what's the minimum necessary behavioral transformation to ensure that similar mistakes are not replicated in the future? And generally that doesn't require it's like if your roof leaks, you don't have to dig a new foundation. You can just fix a few shingles. And you might think, well, the rain's coming through, so you have to tear down the whole house. It's like, well, no, you have to. And you might panic and run around because the water's coming in, but it's still a bad idea to dig up the foundations every time something trivial maintenance problem needs to emerge. And so one of the things that's very useful to learn is like, well, is this only a trivial maintenance problem? And one of the advantages to that too is that if it's not the collapse of your entire self, let's say, and it's a trivial maintenance problem, you're much more able to activate that courageous response to anomaly that's part and parcel of exploratory behavior and eventual success. So, and part of the trick of many sorts of, well, I would say religious training enterprises, certainly the meditative enterprises, is something like, how do you tell yourself a story, like a real story, though a story that actually works, that's most likely to put yourself in a position where you can confidently approach the thing that's blocking your path.
This notion, you brought up 3 points that I think immediately of the related neurology, but I'm going to repeat them back to make sure I understand because they're very salient in my mind right now, which is this notion of the prefrontal cortex trying different versions of self and working with, contending with bodily states in those moments, and the sort of either death or growth or resurrection of those different selves, depending on the outcomes.
Right.
The next, this notion of state or trait, I find fascinating. After I found that piece of paper, I felt like I was like the greatest. I got this huge dopamine surge because it's the delta, it's the difference between your baseline and the peak.
Yeah, right.
So even though I'd lost it, right? I mean, I should have thought, oh gosh, I wasted 30 minutes of our time. But instead, I thought, I found this amazing, and I felt so elated. I think it was the movie Pulp Fiction. I think it was the John Travolta character said something. I'm going to get this wrong, but he said it was almost worth losing that just to find it again. He was talking about something. I forget what it was,
right.
And I think that captured it there as well. And then my question is, however, we've been talking about if you lose something or if an outcome was not great, how that can fan out into a kind of overinterpretation of trait and this kind of depressive neurotic interpretation. Mm-hmm. What about the opposite, where certainly for every success that one has, like for instance, if I had not dropped this piece of paper, I wouldn't have thought of it as a great success. I would have just thought of it as what I was required to do in that moment, right? It was sort of just duty, right? And I'm not somebody who celebrates with everything I check off my list. Sometimes, yes, there are bigger things than others, bigger achievements than others. But I can that certain people might overinflate their wins.
Manics
overinflate. When there it is, the dopamine system.
Yeah, well, for a manic, every possible self is wonderful. And so they're completely fragmented, right? Because every possibility is 100% dopaminergically, giving them a dopaminergic kick. And so it's complete positive emotion catastrophe on the manic side. So these systems, they have to exist in such tight balance, right? Because all of your potential positive selves are not to be regarded with exceptional enthusiasm. That's a form of pathology, even though people don't like being treated for mania often, because especially going into a manic state is very enjoyable because it is associated with enthusiasm. And that's all dopamine-mediated positive emotion. But there are problems with positive emotion. And one is, it needs to be judicious and differentiated. You shouldn't be positive about everything, which is why you shouldn't reward children indiscriminately. It has to be targeted. And so when a system loses its focus and target, its capacity to discriminate, then it becomes pathological. And people don't often think of pathologies of positive emotion, but mania is that's definitely what it is. And it makes people impulsive too. And fragmented even in their speech. Someone who's really manic is a different person every sentence.
It's interesting because one thing that we know, again, about the dopamine system, it's about anticipation. The other thing that is absolutely clear about the dopamine system is that It is tacked to pursuit more than it is to outcomes, but it is highly subjective to interpretation. And this is exciting, actually, and holds great possibility. I mean, putting mania aside, when dopamine is elevated, it tends to put our perception to things outside of I would say beyond the confines of our skin. That person, that potential lover or mate, that food, that reward, that thing.
That target.
It's all about target. And I think this explains why manics are all about plans and the future. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and et cetera.
You see the opposite in neuroticism, because one of the cognitive phenomena that loads very heavily on neuroticism is self-consciousness. And so when you fall into anxiety, then there is this internal obsessiveness, which has to do with the panoply of sins in some sense. Which parts of me are malfunctioning and need to be eradicated? And one of the things I used to do with my socially anxious clients, so they would go into a social situation, often with eyes downcast, by the way, and they would be so intensely concentrating on their own internal sensations that they would fail to make eye contact with anybody they were talking to. And then they would be awkward because they weren't reading the cues they could have read if they would have only looked. And then the conversation would become disjointed. And then they would get anxious and fall into themselves, and then it would just spiral.
I see.
And so one of the things that I taught them to do wasn't to try to calm themselves down, but to try to calm the other person down. So when you go into a social situation, pay more attention to the other person. Like, just focus your attention outward. And if the person had any social skill, sometimes I had clients who had no social skills. And so they were anxious socially because they actually didn't know how to behave socially. So then you had to teach them the social skills. But some of them had the skills but wouldn't activate them because they were so neurotically obsessed with their own inadequacy that they failed to attend to the cues that would elicit the proper responses. And all they had to learn to do was watch. And then they would automatically respond because they knew how to have a conversation.
This brings us to some of the practical tools that I think my laboratory has been working on, which is, many people have heard about the utility of mindfulness meditation, which most typically is close your eyes, focus on third eye center or your breathing, bring your awareness to your so-called interoception. Perception can be interoceptive from the skin inward or exteroceptive to the world outward. The data are showing that people who are overly socially anxious, for instance, they are too much in touch with their bodily signals. In fact, they can count their own. Right. They can count their own heartbeats without taking their pulse with their finger, which is a is a great indicator of how interoceptively aware you are. Those people would probably be best to avoid inward focusing meditation.